I think a lot of people have the sense that the Quran is all about the day of judgment. There are these vivid scenes about judgment, resurrection of the body, heaven, hell, all of this. But you also speak in the article about pleasures in this life. So can we start there? I mean, what does the Quran say about living well in this life?
Absolutely, Gabriel. And I the Quran has a lot to say about the life of this world, and especially the material world versus kind of the spiritual world.
Mhm.
And I think that how we understand Quranic discourse is to consider the environment that the Quran was in. It was, I think that the environment was largely an ascetic environment in which asceticism was extremely.
So sorry to jump in right away. Can you define that term a little bit? So asceticism, what is asceticism?
So asceticism is a set of practices in which uh, people would withhold themselves from material pleasure for spiritual gain, essentially. So this will be familiar from the lives of monks and nuns. There was in late antiquity, the time of the Quran, it was extremely widespread. There were monasteries everywhere where people were essentially living a life of poverty
Yeah.
and a life of in which they did not have a normal household life like they
Yeah,
did.
so no sex,
No
uh,
sex. Yes.
with food, fasting, and even when you're eating, maybe eating only certain foods, like any material pleasures, I guess that's kind of the ascetic thing.
Exactly. It's all about the way that human beings relate to the physical world and the spiritual world. And so for ascetics, the physical world is a world of temptation, and therefore you have to purify yourself from all the aspects of that physical
Right,
world.
right.
Now, the issue with asceticism, I think for the majority is that if that is the peak of spirituality, then there is a tension with households,
Mhm.
right? And
Right,
because the majority of every religion is always going to be householders, right? Not everybody is going to always live in a monastery, or the
right.
religion would die off pretty fast. And so the majority of Christians, even in late antiquity, were
Yeah.
householders, of course.
Not
And there
living
were
in a cave
sermons.
by themselves.
What's that?
Yeah. I was saying not living in a cave by themselves.
They were not living in a cave by themselves, right? And there were sermons addressed to the householders. There were ways of making these teachings available to the householders. But I think the peak of spirituality was still seen by some to be a monastic spirituality. And that's where the Quran comes in with a slightly different perspective, where there is still fasting, there is still, charity, which is really prominent in asceticism. That's also prominent in the Quran, but the householding life is prioritized. So you see the peak of spirituality can be reached within households, and there's where you see the Prophet Muhammad as a very different sort of holy man. Right? He's a holy man who's married. He's a holy man who had children, although most of them didn't survive until adulthood. But he's very much immersed in the life of the world in a certain sense. I mean, the Quran talks about that he's walking in the marketplace, right? And eating food. And so that's where you get this idea that actually, although the material world is a place full of temptations and people are full of desires, which is exactly what the ascetics said, that you get this idea that actually not all of those temptations are um, you don't have to remove yourself from all temptation. You can have a temperate enjoyment of the
So,
world.
yeah, so I hear sometimes Muslims, usually sort of in sermons, khutbahs and things, but sometimes just in academic discourse too, will say, what the Quran does is sort of acknowledge that humans have these desires for sensual pleasures. I mean, yes, sex, but also food or sleep or whatever, like things that, we kind of like that are connected to the senses in some way. The Quran sort of acknowledges that and says, you know, like I know humans can only sort of go so far in depriving themselves. So I guess it is channeling the right word. Like it says, here are the contexts in which you can have sex. There's 1 month a year where you're going to have to eat, not during the day, only at night.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I don't know, like to manage maybe It's a way of managing humans so that, they don't go crazy, they don't become obsessed with sensual things, but they're also not totally deprived. Yeah, what do you think of that way of characterizing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I largely agree with that, but I think it does. I think that in the Quran, you see the life of this world and the material world as being potentially a source of sin, but potentially also a source of salvation.
Mhm.
Okay. So there are a couple of verses of the Quran that talk about giving in charity where
Mm.
it's made really clear that you're not supposed to give everything away. You must give, but you
Mhm.
shouldn't be giving everything.
Not
And
Saint Francis of Assisi,
not
just
St.
giving it
Francis.
all and running
Exactly,
away. Yeah.
exactly. And I think that the reason for that is that once you give everything away, then you become dependent on others. Whereas
Mm.
in the Quranic ideal, you would still be giving all the time. Like you would
Yes.
be,
Yes.
and this is very much connected to the householding nature of that piety, where if you have a religion in households where like there are husband and wife and there's a number of dependents, whether those be children or other relatives, or depending on how rich the household is, slaves, servants, other people who need care, they're all coming in to that household, and therefore piety can be enacted in that way, uh, through that uh, let's see, through the household, but only if not everything is given away.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I guess that,
Yeah.
yeah, like, therefore, I guess I agree to some extent with what those sermons are saying, but I think that you have to, it's the recognition that that wealth that people have can either be a source of downfall, spiritual downfall, or it can be a
Mhm.
source of spiritual salvation, right?
Mhm.
And equally, your desires, right? Are you going to channel them appropriately, or are you going to just absolutely
Yeah.
go for
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
And I feel like there's some places in the Quran where the Quran sort of uses our attraction to different sensual pleasures, not always, maybe sensual is the wrong word, but physical pleasures as a sort of starting point to speak about the greater pleasures of paradise. I think we're on 3 around verse 14.
Yeah.
There's this
3:14.
interesting verb that's used, zuyina. So it's a passive verb, which basically means like, I don't know, it has been made beautiful. It has been made adorned for a human's the love of these shahawat, the love of these fancies.
Desires.
And I forget what it mentions exactly. I think they're like
Yeah.
horses, male children, stuff like that. Maybe women,
Horses,
I
women
forget.
and children,
Okay.
piles of gold and silver,
Yeah.
livestock farms.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then it leverages that almost to say,
Yes.
listen, okay, like this is part of human nature. You like this stuff. Let me tell you about something even better is to orient yourself towards paradise.
Exactly. So it's not saying you have to give it all up, but
Mhm.
it is saying that the greater good is always going to be with God. And
Yeah.
then in the Quran, of course, you also have the idea of physical resurrection and a sensual afterlife where everyone has
Yes.
what they desire. And there are
Yes.
verses that say that. And using those terms of desire. And that's a very crucial part of it too, because the restraint in this life is also rewarded in the next life in that
Yes.
sense.
Yes.